One of the interesting things about this year for me has been the fact that it's the occasion of multiple milestone anniversaries for Nintendo's long-running Donkey Kong series. Although Nintendo hasn't done much to draw attention to them officially, as it has in the past for series like Mario and Zelda. This year marks the 10th anniversary of the release of Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze, a Wii U title that eventually managed to sell more than 2 million copies, despite its old-school platformer design, high difficulty, and, being on the Wii U. The older style of platformer was actually experiencing a kind of renaissance around this time, with contemporaries like Rayman Legends and Shovel Knight standing alongside Tropical Freeze as evidence that there was still life in this style of game, that a game didn't have to have the words new and Mario in it to justify a commitment to two-dimensional design. But this is also the 30th anniversary of a game that sold much better than Tropical Freeze, or any of its contemporary peers could hope to, and that had a much greater and more lasting influence on the gaming landscape as a whole. This is a game that was created not during the recent revival of platformers, but during their original golden age, when a new game with 2D graphics and platformer mechanics landed less like a warm, nostalgic breeze, and more like a gale-force wind that either sweeps you along in its wake or blows past and leaves you choking in a cloud of dust. A generation ago, back in 1994, this was the time for platformers to grow out of their 8-bit roots and show the world that cereal mascots and professional wrestlers weren't the only ones with attitude. And the game that led the charge was the original Donkey Kong Country, which released in November of that year, and had already sold 6 million copies by the end of the holiday season. And if you think that's impressive, in between these two milestones, 20 years ago, right, that was when Donkey Kong Jungle Beat came out in Japan. So maybe that doesn't belong on the list after all. Don't get me wrong, I really liked Jungle Beat, and it was kind of a prototype for Super Mario Galaxy a few years later, which is cool, but I don't know. Somehow I still feel that Donkey Kong during this period was in a bit of a lull that wouldn't be broken until the release of Donkey Kong Country Returns in 2010. The GameCube and Game Boy Advance era saw amazing strides forward in so many great Nintendo franchises, but Donkey Kong wasn't one of them. In a way, though, this is quite a relevant milestone for us today, because that's exactly the situation we're in. That platformer renaissance that started with Mega Man 9 and ended with Shantae and the Pirate's Curse may have been sweet, but it was also short, and we've been doing without it at this point for longer than it existed to begin with. One thing that Tropical Freeze, Rayman Legends, and Shovel Knight have in common is that in the decades since they released, none of them has had a proper sequel, even though 2 of these games were themselves sequels to successful throwback platformers from earlier in the decade. Now, in some cases, there's a reasonable explanation for the lack of follow-up. Rayman Legends didn't sell nearly as well as Ubisoft had hoped it would, and soon after it released, series creator Michel Ancel got really wrapped up in his plans for Beyond Good and Evil 2. Of course, we all know how well that went, and he's not even with Ubisoft anymore. So apart from the occasional cameo in DLC for bizarre spin-off turn-based strategy games, I don't think we'll be seeing much of Rayman for the foreseeable future. As for Shovel Knight, I've talked before about the problems that one-hit wonder indie studios have in trying to build on their massive hit games. You could argue that the various Kickstarter-funded bonus campaigns are basically sequels, but if so, then they're really short sequels, none of which gives you the experience of using Shovel Knight's special skills in new and innovative ways. Plus, they all feature basically the same characters. But I can still see why Yacht Club Games hasn't been super eager to make Shovel Knight 2, which would also be a terrible title. I hope they don't go with that if they do end up making a sequel. The real odd one out here is Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze. Sure, it didn't sell all that well, but that was clearly due to the Wii U's low install base. Almost everybody who played it said it was fantastic, substantially better than Donkey Kong Country Returns, in fact, at least when it comes to style and atmosphere. It seems like Retro had really mastered this new design language they were working with, and they weren't working seriously on anything else after Tropical Freeze came out. Remember, they didn't get assigned to Metroid Prime 4 until after the project was rebooted in 2019. So another DKC game would seem like a natural fit for the development talent that Nintendo had on hand. But it wasn't to be. In the last decade, there hasn't been a single Donkey Kong game of any kind, and honestly, that's just so disappointing. All this time I've been hoping that Nintendo would give itself another shot at perfecting this genre, because they're so close to it, and none of the games they've made since has managed to capture the unique charm of Donkey Kong Country. Oh, and just to be clear, when I say that, I mean they've never managed to equal the original game, the one from 1994 that is just called Donkey Kong Country. That's the one they've never surpassed, in the 30 years since it came out. Now hold on, you might be saying. That can't be right. You're saying not only that Retro's two masterpieces aren't as good as the SNES game whose legacy they're built on, but also that the two sequels made by Rare that came out within 2 years of the original's release and were made by basically the same team with more resources at their disposal and more experience are worse? Well, in a way, yes. And believe me, when this thought first occurred to me, it seemed just as odd as it probably seems to you right now. It's certainly not what I believed when I was a kid and playing the 3 Donkey Kong Country games for the first time. And I'm not saying that the original Donkey Kong Country is objectively more fun to play, or that it's better than its 2 sequels in every way. Just that the overall impression I get from it is better than what I get from any other Donkey Kong game. And in fact, the whole story of the development of the Donkey Kong Country franchise is an old and familiar one. A story of a team that, having hit on a golden formula with their very first game, arrives at the task of making a sequel and is so tempted to fiddle with the formula that they almost literally cannot help themselves. So if we want to know what Donkey Kong Country is all about, we need to know about the circumstances that produced it, which means we need to know what was going on with the Donkey Kong franchise in 1993, when Nintendo first handed it over to Rare. And the answer to that question is practically nothing. The original Donkey Kong had been an unbelievable hit when it came to the arcades in 1981. It basically made Nintendo's reputation in the West, and laid the groundwork for their successful release of the Famicom 2 years later, not to mention jump-starting the career of a certain beleaguered Italian plumber, who would later become one of the biggest brand mascots of all time. But the same year the Famicom was introduced, 1983, also marked the last Donkey Kong game that Nintendo would release for 11 long years. See, the thing is that even in the short time the franchise had existed, Donkey Kong had already outstayed its welcome in the eyes of most players, at least in the video game arcades where it was usually played back then. Donkey Kong was stupidly profitable. Nintendo had sold 60,000 units by late 1982, and I'm not talking about the little Game & Watch things, I mean 60,000 cabinets. It was the single highest earning arcade game in Japan in 1981, and the next year it was the highest earning game in the US. This is Pac-Man money we're talking about. Meanwhile, Donkey Kong Jr., which came out the next year, was the 8th best-selling arcade game in Japan for 1982. It didn't even outcompete the original Donkey Kong, which came in 6th that year, despite the fact that everybody had already played it 100 times. And Donkey Kong 3, a year later, fared even worse, especially in the United States, where the backlash against Atari 2600 shovelware was in full swing, slashing the sales of practically every game at home and in arcades. Nintendo looked at these steeply diminishing returns, shrugged their shoulders, and said, okay, it was a good franchise while it lasted. There didn't seem to be a lot of juice left in this banana, and rather than try to force it, they sensibly decided to move on. And even after the NES became a blockbuster in the US, they still weren't that interested in continuing where they left off with Donkey Kong. Nintendo at this time was really locked into new franchise mode, creating series like The Legend of Zelda, Metroid, and especially Super Mario Bros. They didn't have time to reboot a franchise that had kicked the bucket half a decade before. Half a decade was a lifetime in the video game world back then. The most they were willing to do was scrape together a few ports and compilations, which actually sold pretty well, but this was clearly just an aftershock compared with the earthquake that Donkey Kong had once been. Nintendo was feeling pretty comfortable with their decisions as the SNES was being developed at the turn of the 1990s. They didn't have any reason to regret leaving Donkey Kong behind when there were greener pastures right in front of them. They were on top of the video game market, and their finger was on the pulse of America's youth-oriented culture. Everything was great. And then Sega happened.
You can't do this on Nintendo Genesis.
Does.
Genesis.
Does.
Genesis.
Does. What Nintendo?
Yeah, we all laugh at this stuff now, right? It's primo cheesy 90s kid cringe, and we're all so used to stuff like this that it feels tame and harmless. But if you were Nintendo back in 1993, this wasn't funny. This was scary as hell. Sonic the Hedgehog outsold Super Mario World in 1991. Not only that, during the holiday season of that year, the Genesis outsold the SNES in America by almost 2-1, largely driven by marketing that made Nintendo seem behind the times. Sega wasn't just a tough contender, it was fast. And I'm not just talking about the blue blur here. They came out with new hits fast, with Sonic 2 coming out a mere year after Sonic 1, and Sonic 3 a little more than a year after that. And unlike Nintendo's old arcade titles, which also came out quickly, these games just kept selling. There was a certain tapering off of sales, especially with Sonic 3, but much less so than what had happened to Donkey Kong 10 years before. Nintendo could feel itself being pushed off the top of the heap, in terms of both sales and public opinion. The Sonic series alone was enough to scare the pants off Nintendo, but of course, Sega didn't just have Sonic. They also had Aladdin, a tie-in game for the ultra-successful Disney film of the same name that sold about 4 million copies, making a very tidy profit for Sega and their partner Virgin Games. And one of the biggest selling points of this game was its super smooth animation, with actual Disney animators drawing the frames by hand before they were rendered into pixel art. To be fair, this was not the end of the world for Nintendo. Capcom had also successfully bid for the rights to make an Aladdin game, which they released on the SNES, selling about 1.8 million copies. Personally, speaking as a 90s kid, I prefer the Capcom game, but my opinion doesn't count for much. The market said otherwise, as did Capcom legend Shinji Mikami, who actually designed the SNES game and still thought the Genesis version was superior. If that's not a bad sign, I don't know what is. Nintendo needed an edge. They needed to scoop Sega by coming up with something, mechanics, visuals, humor, something that Sega wasn't already doing. And the best tool they had for the job was their relationship with a prolific game developer in the UK known as Rare. Rare's founders, the Stamper brothers, had more or less bluffed their way into a partnership with Nintendo in the mid-80s by flying out to Kyoto and personally demonstrating to the head of Nintendo of America that they had managed to reverse engineer the code on the NES, meaning that effectively they could make games for it whether or not they had Nintendo's permission. These days, the Stampers might have found themselves facing a lawsuit, or at least stonewalling from Nintendo executives, but Minoru Arakawa was apparently impressed by their dedication, and soon they were given the official NES seal of approval. In the following years, Rare made a number of successful NES titles, most notably the racing game RC Pro-Am in 1988, and the platformer beat-em-up hybrid Battletoads in 1991. But by the early 1990s, they faced growing concerns that they were falling behind the technology curve. So instead of starting to develop for the SNES right away, they chose to invest their profits in several cutting-edge Silicon Graphics workstations and spend some time learning how to use them effectively. One of the most impressive functions of these computers was to produce convincing three-dimensional renders of physical objects, which incidentally, Pixar would later use to animate the original Toy Story in 1995. This wouldn't seem to be of much use for a game console that could only display two-dimensional graphics, and in fact, Rare was mostly expecting to use it on games for the N64, which was already in development at the time. However, they soon discovered that they could bridge the technology gap by animating models in 3D and then compressing the resulting images into pixel art, essentially taking 2D snapshots of a moving 3D model. The resulting images would exist as sprites inside a two-dimensional game world, but they would preserve to a certain extent the detail of the original model. In other words, they would look 3D. And as it turned out, this was exactly the edge their publisher was looking for. Rare showed the tech off to Nintendo with a project called Brute Force, a fighting game that would later morph into Killer Instinct. But as they discussed the possibilities, a new idea emerged. Why not use this in a platformer? Nintendo as a brand was strongly associated with platformers, after all, and maybe they were also hoping to fire a shot back at Sega by beating Sonic the Hedgehog at his own game, as it were. But in order to beat Sonic, this game had to feature a main character with the same kind of cachet that Sonic had. Mario wouldn't do. On top of the fact that he'd already been tarred with the boring brush by Sega's aggressive marketing, Nintendo wanted to make future Mario games itself, not hand them off to second-party partners. Most of the currently prominent Nintendo franchises would have similar problems, but there was one franchise which carried almost no risk at all, even if the game flopped. Donkey Kong. He was familiar to the public, thanks to his arcade successes in the early 80s. He was an animal who could be given the requisite amount of 90s attitude, like Sonic, and his personality and the world he lived in were vaguely defined enough that Rare could be given free rein to add their own sensibilities and construct a new identity for him. As opportunities to make a hit go, it was just about perfect. And so the 12-person team at Rare knuckled down to a grueling 18-month production schedule that finally ended, as Nintendo had hoped, just in time for Thanksgiving of 1994, the perfect time to maximize holiday purchases and ensure that the game would sell like crazy. And boy did it ever. I mentioned before that Donkey Kong Country sold 6 million copies in a little less than 2 months during the holiday season of 1994, and you might be wondering what it was about this game that caused it to sell that well that quickly. The easiest answer to that question is that it was a fantastic game, and that Nintendo, having learned a thing or two from Sega in the last few years, spent a lot of money marketing it. Their ad spend in the United States alone amounted to $16 million, more than 3 times the typical marketing budget for a comparable game. The industry had reached a point where a hit game could make even more money than a hit film or album, so Nintendo decided to market Rare's efforts the way James Cameron or Steven Spielberg would, and it paid off for them. But what was there to advertise? What was the hook that made Donkey Kong Country worth the hype? Well, if you examine contemporary reviews of the game, and Nintendo's ad copy, it appears to be the same thing that made Sega's Aladdin such a blockbuster: graphics. Donkey Kong Country had the kind of visuals that most people had never seen before in anything, other than maybe a television commercial. Remember, this is before even Toy Story, and while some early CG animated series like VeggieTales existed at this point, they weren't very popular or even widely known to the general public yet. But it wasn't just the pseudo 3D rendering style that made Donkey Kong Country a good-looking game. In fact, if they had just taken a normal 16-bit aesthetic and applied their new tech to it, that probably would have looked awful. Early CG was a risky proposition that could easily sink into the uncanny valley if the designers weren't careful. If you want proof of that, just look at the Donkey Kong cartoon series from a few years later. This isn't just the effects of time either. Even back then, a lot of this stuff was considered ugly. So Rare's artists, 4 people out of a 12-person team you'll notice, were careful to emphasize the things that their rendering technology did well, and minimize its inherent limitations. For example, one thing that pops out right away is how much movement each on-screen object engages in as you play, which required the team to draw a lot of sprites to represent each in-between state. But this was easy for them. After all, they were just moving the models around and then taking snapshots, the way a claymation artist would, not hand-drawing every single frame the way a traditional animator had to. And it's incredible how alive this makes the whole setting feel, even after 30 years of graphical innovations. Enemy characters in Donkey Kong Country don't just shuffle across the screen or wobble up and down. They move every part of their body, open and close their mouths as they move to strike, flap their wings, crunch their jaws, and cross their eyes in pain when you jump on their heads. Donkey and Diddy are always active, somersaulting and cartwheeling along the floor, or slapping each other 5 when they trade places. And even when you aren't moving, such as when you stand still or get on an animal buddy, they're still fidgeting and looking around, still being animated the entire time. The only things that tend not to move are the numbers appearing in the top left and right corners, and elements in the background. But even that can be misleading. Some of the more complex levels in this game actually have a fair amount of action going on in the background, like rainstorms or sunsets gradually fading into and out of view. In fact, one of these levels, Snow Barrel Blast, contains what is possibly my favorite background effect in any game ever. As the level begins, you find yourself on a rocky mountaintop, where everything from the ground to the trees is covered in snow. However, the sky looks quite blue and placid, so at first you don't think much of it. Then, as you progress a bit further, the sky in the background darkens, giving the impression that night is falling. A few more steps, and a light snowfall begins in the background, suggesting that this may not be night approaching after all, but rather a snowstorm, similar to the one that must have blanketed the mountain before you arrived. Just then, the color of the sky changes again, from dark blue to a lighter grayish white, making it clear that this is a snowstorm you're dealing with. The sky continues to get brighter and brighter, not because the sun is coming back out, but because there's more snow in the air, coming inexorably closer to the front of the screen, until finally, bam! The screen is covered with snow. This is a proper blizzard, the kind that people get lost and die in. And this barrage of snow lasts for the entire second half of the level, even in bonus stages, until you make it to the next stage, which takes place inside an icy cave. This level is frightening. Nothing about it is explicitly horrific or anything, but the gradual encroachment of a very realistic-feeling blizzard on my character's location hits very close to home for me. I think we've all had an experience of being lost outside and worrying that we might not get back to safety before something bad happens. And this level, with its intense atmosphere, understated but creepy music, and surprising level of difficulty, just lights up that part of my brain that tells me I need to go inside and bolt all the doors. Speaking of that music, by the way, another really obvious strong point of the original Donkey Kong Country was its soundtrack, composed by David Wise, Robin Beanland, and Eveline Fisher, now called Eveline Novakovic. This was an absolute triumph of 16-bit game music, drawing from a very rich set of influences, including techno, jazz, industrial music, new age electronica, and probably a few more genres neither of us have ever heard of. I have pretty eclectic musical tastes, so while I can't say for sure what Rare's composers listened to while they were making this soundtrack, I can tell you that it reminds me of tracks by lots of pop and rock artists, particularly British ones active in the 1980s. Tears for Fears, New Order, Cocteau Twins, XTC, Genesis, Echo and the Bunnymen, the list goes on. Donkey Kong Country's soundtrack is just as experimental as those bands were, and most of the experiments are brilliantly executed and fun to listen to, whether or not you're actually playing the game. But aesthetics can only carry a game so far, no matter how charming they may be. There has to be a fun game underneath for the visuals and music to enhance. I think that the overall atmosphere of Donkey Kong Country served mainly to get a foot in the door, so to speak, and the real reason that word of mouth was so positive was the game's mechanical design. The designers talked a lot about being influenced by Super Mario Bros. 3, and what they seem to have drawn most from that was the idea of matching simple movement mechanics with complex set pieces that can be interacted with using just the basic mechanics. These set pieces are quite creative and a lot of fun to experience, but I think even when you take them together with the visuals and music, this is still just scratching the surface of what makes Donkey Kong Country such a special game. And we all know that the surface is not the best part of a banana. To get to the really juicy part, we have to dig deeper, to the structure that lies beneath. What I've discussed up to this point is the stuff that everyone mentions when they bring up Donkey Kong Country, the graphics, the soundtrack, and so on. And I'm not trying to demean these things at all when I say that they're a bit overexposed. They are important parts of the experience. Rare spent a lot of time on them, and that effort was absolutely worth it. The reason I insist that they aren't that important is that Rare also put a lot of effort into the game's structure and the overall feel of playing it. And these are things I don't really see people talking about. For instance, anyone can tell you that aquatic ambiance, the musical theme that plays during underwater levels, is beautiful and incredibly atmospheric, or that the minecart levels are terrifying and tense. But because these types of levels are so memorable, I think people tend to forget other levels which are more typical of the overall experience. There are a lot of mechanical gimmicks scattered throughout the levels of Donkey Kong Country, just like in Super Mario Bros. 3 and most other successful platformers. Some of them are only present for a single level, like the automatic sliding ropes in Slip Slide Ride, or the on and off lighting in Blackout Basement. But at the same time, it's very uncommon for a level to only have a gimmick and nothing else. Generally, the gimmicks are combined with the same platforming challenges you see in other levels. There are about half a dozen basic platforming elements in Donkey Kong Country, most of which get thrown at the player during the first world: swinging ropes, bouncy tires, barrel cannons, moving platforms, stationary traps or enemies, and moving traps or enemies. And while the game has underwater levels with different movement mechanics, minecart and moving platform levels where you don't control your movement speed or direction, and boss encounters, for the most part the game's levels, gimmicky or not, consist of combinations of these basic elements. So to take the first world, Congo Jungle, as an example, in its first stage, Jungle Hijinks, you deal with basic jumps and moving enemies. In Ropey Rampage, you're introduced to swinging ropes. Reptile Rumble demonstrates how bouncy tires work. And Barrel Cannon Canyon is almost entirely about using barrel cannons. Coral Capers is the only level that doesn't teach you a new basic mechanic, although there are 4 underwater levels in the game, so it's beneficial to have a tutorial for them this early. Congo Jungle is the least gimmicky world you'll encounter. Apart from the boss, none of the levels is lacking in basic platforming challenges, and all but one have you practicing skills you'll be using for the entire rest of the game. From that point onward, each world gets a little more gimmick-driven than the last, until World 6, the Chimp Caverns, which is not as gimmicky, or as difficult, in my opinion, as the world which preceded it. I have a theory as to why this is, but I'll save that for a bit later when I'm talking about the few things that players tended not to like about Donkey Kong Country. For now, let's instead take a look at World 4, Gorilla Glacier, and see how it compares to Congo Jungle. The first stage, Snow Barrel Blast, has a graphical gimmick with the snowstorm, but it's not really gimmicky in gameplay terms. It features a combination of barrel cannons, bottomless pits, and moving enemies, some of which can be defeated by jumping on them and some of which can't. Slip Slide Ride does have a prominent gameplay gimmick, with its ropes that automatically send you up or down while you cling to them. Ice Age Alley features the same hazards as Snow Barrel Blast, basically barrel cannons and moving enemies. Croctopus Chase is an underwater level with invincible enemies that chase you along set paths. Torchlight Trouble has a lighting gimmick, but most of the difficulty comes from having to make tight jumps and avoid running into enemies. And Rope Bridge Rumble has the same setting as Treetop Town from World 3, but replaces that level's barrel cannons with bouncy tires, moving platforms, and stationary enemies. So we can see that even though Gorilla Glacier is more gimmicky than Congo Jungle, gimmicks still aren't the main focus. Half of these stages arguably don't have mechanical gimmicks at all, and 2 of the other 3 have a mix of gimmick challenges and basic challenges. Slip Slide Ride is the only one in which I would say the gimmick overpowers the basic platforming gameplay. And I think this dedication to keeping the player sharp on the fundamentals is an indication of how much Rare had matured as a game developer in a very short time. This was only 3 years after they released Battletoads for the NES, but the approaches of these 2 games are worlds apart. Battletoads is an insane hodgepodge of bizarre, often confusing, but always punishingly difficult level concepts. One moment you're on a jet, zooming through impossibly tight gaps in a series of electrical barriers. Next you're taking leaps of faith to land on giant snakes moving in and out of the walls. Then landing a series of kicks on a fast-moving rat so you can make it to a bomb before it blows you up with it. Then executing a ludicrously precise series of directional button presses to barely keep away from a giant cream saver that instantly kills you if you make a single mistake. I am firmly of the opinion that Battletoads was not designed to be beaten by the vast majority of people who played it. The fact that it's clearly arcade-influenced isn't enough of an explanation for how brutal it is. Arcade games are designed to whittle your health down so you have to put more quarters in, not to give you a challenge that you'll die at after practicing it 100 times. And one of the hardest things about this game is that getting good at the earlier stages doesn't necessarily make later ones any easier. The game is so gimmick-driven and rambling that every level has the potential to stymie and frustrate you to no end. You don't really get good at Battletoads. You get good at each stage individually, and hope that your skills of the others haven't deteriorated in the meantime. Curiously, there are still traces of the Battletoads legacy present in Donkey Kong Country. The sections where you travel on a moving rope through a cloud of zingers in Forest Frenzy bear something of a resemblance to Volkmeyer's Inferno in Battletoads, and Slip Slide Ride has a visual theme and level geometry that resembles the Arctic Caverns. There's a level in Diddy's Conquest that mimics it even more closely. And the chase sequences in Croctopus Chase look and feel a lot like the sections in the Terratubes where you get chased by giant gears, including the spinning motions and the fact that this happens underwater. It's also unquestionably true that Donkey Kong Country is a harder than average game, and it seems that Rare originally intended for it to be even harder before Nintendo asked them to tone it down. I do find this a bit odd. I mean, the game we ended up with is arguably easier than Nintendo's own Super Mario Bros. 3, but as an introduction to platformers, this would still be very challenging. Nevertheless, Donkey Kong Country is well within the abilities of an average gamer. I played through it just a few weeks ago, and managed to get all the way through in about 6 hours, only dying twice to the infamously tough final boss. You might think I'm bragging here, but the truth is that beating Donkey Kong Country isn't really a boast-worthy achievement. Unlike Battletoads, this game is designed to help you win. The emphasis on platforming fundamentals instead of gimmicks means that most of the time you're honing skills that are transferable to almost every other level. If you play World 1 10 times, I guarantee you can beat Worlds 2 and 3 without too much trouble, and the same goes for later in the game. Can this game do anything wrong? Well, that depends on who you ask. I've heard criticism of the boss battles in particular for being really easy, which they are, and also that the bonus areas are repetitive and not that interesting. One thing I've also noticed myself, although I've never heard anyone else bring it up, is that some of the levels are really short, shorter than I remembered. Winky's Walkway particularly feels like a loading zone between levels rather than a proper level, and a few levels end rather abruptly without reaching a climax at any point. Here's the weird part though. I actually like all these things, and think they help to reinforce Donkey Kong Country's atmosphere in the same way that the visuals and the music do. What this game has over practically any other Nintendo game is its pacing. Donkey Kong Country is a game where things happen quickly and explosively. You move fast, you die fast, and you get back into the action fast after dying. Most of the things you interact with have the potential to increase your speed, including enemies if you cartwheel or somersault through them. All the animal buddies increase your speed in some way, either directly or by making it easier to blow through enemies. Even though I've never heard it described as this, Donkey Kong Country is basically Nintendo's answer to Sonic the Hedgehog, in that it's a game where the pace of movement is largely dictated by your own skill and comfort level. You can go slow if you want, but the game clearly wants you to go fast. Notice how both of these games have your player character fidget and look at the screen when you're not moving, unlike Mario, who stoically remains in place like the responsible adult human person he is. The few levels that aren't like this, such as underwater and minecart levels, just go to show that Donkey Kong Country has more variety than Sonic, and tests several different skills. So why are the bosses so easy? Simple. It's because the game isn't about combat. The end-of-world boss battles are more like a chance to catch your breath than a legitimate challenge, all except the last one, Gangplank Galleon, which capitalizes on your expectations of easy boss battles by gulling you into playing sloppily and then absolutely taking you to the cleaners, which feels exactly like how K. Rool would try to win a fight with DK. Why are the bonus levels so underdeveloped? Because the game wants to get you back into the real meat of the action quickly. Finding the bonus levels is the fun part, not playing them. The real benefit is the extra lives you get, which help you make it through difficult sections later on. And the short levels? I feel that these are one of Donkey Kong Country's cleverest touches, because they make the game world feel more real. A lot of platformers, as well as games in other genres, seem to have a very standardized length for their levels, as if players will want their money back unless every level takes at least a certain amount of time to complete. But the divisions between one level and another are totally arbitrary. If you can give a player 2 short levels instead of 1 normal-sized one, and 2 short levels would suit your artistic goals better, why not do it that way? Donkey Kong Country is a game that makes use of conventions when that helps teach the player something, like leaving a trail of bananas to point out secrets, or serves an important design goal, like having enemies that can't be jumped on but can be destroyed in other ways. But it's not wedded to any conventions, and it's willing to break them in order to preserve its own identity. A great example of that is World 6, Chimp Caverns. Like I said before, this level seems easier than the one before it. At least, I got through it faster and with fewer lives lost, which is pretty close to objective as a measure of difficulty. Now this isn't very intuitive, but it does make some sense when you consider that Donkey Kong Country is 1, a pretty short game, and 2, a game with a deceptively tough final boss. Chimp Caverns isn't there to stop your progress right before the end. It's meant to hurry you along towards it, making you wonder what the game is really going for before it hits you with a massive twist. Does the game suffer from having this unusual difficulty curve? I don't think so. I think it's differences like this that make Donkey Kong Country so uniquely interesting. Lots of games, especially from Nintendo, have beautiful graphics and great soundtracks without necessarily being as memorable as Donkey Kong Country. Lots of games have fun platforming challenges, but not many have the guts to design a level like Winky's Walkway that you can finish in a minute and a half. The market is full of games that wear their influences on their sleeves. What's funny about Donkey Kong Country is that even though it was inspired by other games, you have to squint pretty hard to see what it borrows from them, because the game is so unapologetically its own thing. It's such a unique product, in fact, that neither Rare nor Nintendo would ever make anything quite like it again. In the wake of Donkey Kong Country's breakout success, both Nintendo and Rare were eager to strike while the iron was hot. Any game that sold more than 1 million copies back then practically demanded a sequel, and in just over a year, Rare had one ready for the holiday season of 1995. Donkey Kong Country 2, Diddy's Kong Quest. Donkey Kong was written out of the action this time, having been kidnapped by his old nemesis King K. Rool. Well, Captain K. Rool, technically. So Diddy and his girlfriend Dixie Kong are called on to invade Crocodile Isle and jump on a lot of heads until they find him. In a reversal of the first game's story, rather than traversing their own home island to reach a pirate ship with stolen treasure, in this outing our heroes start on a pirate ship and then make their way through K. Rool's home turf to rescue the monkey's uncle himself. In many ways, Donkey Kong Country 2 was recognized at the time as a younger, edgier chip off the old block. Apart from Dixie's ability to glide through the air with her ponytail, the hero's moves and mechanics were changed very little, with Diddy controlling almost identically to his past self. The basic platforming elements were also mostly carried over: ropes, barrel cannons, bouncy tires, and enemies and traps both stationary and moving. One notable change is that there are considerably fewer moving platforms in Diddy's Conquest, probably because Dixie's increased mobility would take away a lot of the challenge involved in landing on them. Other than that, though, it's easy to see how a veteran of Donkey Kong Country could jump right into this new game and feel right at home. Of course, that was itself a problem the designers needed to tackle. If you'd already beaten Donkey Kong Country half a dozen times, another equally challenging experience would probably feel too simple for your liking. Rare had actually received complaints the year before that the original game was too easy. Yeah, those people existed back in the mid-90s too. And you might recall that the vision they started with was for a substantially harder game. So with Diddy's Conquest, they chose to ramp up the difficulty and throw players off their rhythm with unexpected gameplay shifts. If you've played both of these games, it goes without saying that Diddy's Conquest features a lot more gameplay variety than its predecessor. The original game had straightforward platforming levels, minecart levels, underwater levels, and levels where you rode on a moving platform or rope. In terms of basic level structure, that was about it. The sequel has straightforward platforming levels, minecart levels, underwater levels, levels where you ride on a moving platform, levels where you ride changing wind currents, levels where you turn into an animal buddy with different movement mechanics and attacks, and totally vertical levels where you spend almost the entire time climbing on ropes, and I'm probably forgetting another one. You might think of a couple of these as being closer to an individual level gimmick than an overall level style, and there's a case to be made for that. More importantly, even if you leave them out, there are still more level gimmicks in Diddy's Kong Quest than in the original Donkey Kong Country. A big part of the increased difficulty comes from the challenge of maneuvering through obstacles with altered movement mechanics, especially when you pick up or get turned into one of the animal buddies. One change that I've never heard anybody discuss is that the animal buddies went from being 100% optional in the original game to mostly mandatory in Diddy's Kong Quest. This is a massive change in how the levels work, and I'm surprised it hasn't been commented on more. In the last game, every level was designed to suit Donkey's and Diddy's abilities, and the animal buddies just made certain parts easier and gave you an extra hit. Now the levels are designed to work specifically with the animal buddy abilities, and you're not allowed to go through them as Diddy or Dixie. Not that you would even be able to in most cases, but the game doesn't let you figure that out for yourself. With Diddy's Kong Quest, there's less of a sense that you're mastering the game itself, and more that you're learning each level individually, developing skills that may be transferable to other levels, but also, maybe not. It's not nearly as bad as Battletoads in this respect, but it is a little disconcerting to see Rare moving back in that direction after Donkey Kong Country made such a strong case for doing the opposite. Does that make Diddy's Kong Quest an inferior game? No, of course not. As many reviewers have noted, this game improves on a lot of the things that Donkey Kong Country introduced. The visuals are fantastic here, just as polished as before, but with much more variety in what's being portrayed. You can tell that they were having more fun in coming up with this game's style, compared with the more realistic and down-to-earth approach of the original. The soundtrack is breathtaking. I wouldn't call it as diverse as the originals, possibly because David Wise was the only composer this time. But the interweaving of tribal drums, ethereal synths, and surprisingly realistic sound effects makes most levels as much a feast for the ears as they are for the eyes. There's a reason that Stickerbush Symphony is just as famous as Aquatic Ambiance, and tracks like Forest Interlude and Crook's March provide ample evidence of Wise's multi-layered compositional talents. I've always been a sucker for good art design, and I have to admit that back when these games were new, I was a much bigger fan of Diddy's Kong Quest than the original Donkey Kong Country, which I barely played as a kid. Here's the funny part though. Even though I loved Diddy's Kong Quest, I never actually finished it. And part of the reason for that is that finishing the game got a lot harder to do between installments. You see, bonus rooms in this game aren't just for extra lives anymore. Like the animal buddies, they're now an essential part of the journey. You have to find and complete every last one in order to get the medals you need to give to some guy so he'll let you go through the bonus Lost World and track down K. Rool for the true final encounter. Of course, he just comes right back in the next game anyway, but still. This new approach encourages a lot of backtracking and replaying finished levels in order to find all the secrets. It takes what had been a fairly straightforward platformer and turns it into a hybrid of platformer and collectathon. And admittedly, this does make the experience richer for the player, providing additional challenge and replay value. But it can also be really tiresome and make you start to hate levels which originally left a good impression on you. And even though the 102% ending is technically optional, the fact that it exists at all sucks a bit of the fun out of beating the game normally. The original Donkey Kong Country at least pretended that by completing a regular playthrough, you'd seen everything there was to see. The only thing that told you otherwise was an easily ignorable percentage figure on the save screen. Here, you're constantly having hints thrown at you about all the secret stuff you haven't found yet. And even if you go through the whole rigmarole of beating all 75 bonus rooms, completing the hyper-difficult Lost World levels, and thrashing K. Rool once and for all, if you miss one single DK coin, Cranky will laugh in your face and tell you suck. So that's what you have to look forward to after seeing the game's first ending. But guess what? The dirty truth is that I didn't even get that far. Diddy's Kong Quest is fully capable of breaking your spirit long before you save the Kong. Toxic Tower has always been a miserable experience for me, and that's not even the last full level before you fight K. Rool. That dubious honor goes to Screech's Sprint, a soul-crushing combination of the fiddly squawks movement from Bramble Scramble, and a very strict time limit that pushes you to, more often than not, flap straight into a wall and die. I swear to God, you could spend more time trying to beat this one level than it takes to finish the entirety of Donkey Kong Country. It is Battletoads level mean. And when you consider that this challenge is required if you want to see an ending, you have to wonder what was going through their heads when they included it. So even though there's a lot to love about Diddy's Conquest, I just don't think it has the same enduring charm as its predecessor because it's so damn frustrating. There's a lot to love and a lot to hate, and for any given player, one of these reactions may overpower the other. I have a lower than average repugnance toward backtracking and replaying finished levels, which is probably why I preferred it as a kid, but even I have my limits. So that leaves us with 1996's Donkey Kong Country 3, Dixie's Double Trouble, a game that I don't have a lot to say about here, not because it isn't interesting or I don't like it, quite the opposite actually, but because it mostly stuck to the same general approach as Diddy's Conquest, so much so that it comes dangerously close to self-parody at times. Now Donkey and Diddy have been kidnapped, and Dixie drags her baby cousin Kitty along with her to rescue them from the castle of Baron K. Rulenstein, yes, that is actually the name they went with, in the Northern Cremisphere. There's still a mixture of basic platforming challenges and unique level gimmicks, with perhaps a slight increase in gimmickry from the last game. You still go through each level in a world linearly, ending with a boss battle, although you have more freedom to choose the order of the worlds themselves, and there's still a clear distinction between beating the game by getting to the last level, and actually beating it by collecting all the bonus room medals, finding the lost world, beating a bunch of much harder secret levels, and finally settling K. Rool's hash for good. Although in this game, they don't bother pretending that he dies at the end. He literally just winds up with egg on his face. Dixie's Double Trouble is the silliest of the three games, and the one with the craziest gimmicks, especially in the boss fights, which are actually a highlight here, not mindlessly easy like they were in the first game, or obnoxiously hard like in the second. Well, not usually anyway. I would say that it's somewhat easier than Diddy's Conquest, but only because that game's occasional insane difficulty spikes have been smoothed out. A typical late-game level is about equally hard in both games. And crucially, neither game manages to capture the same flow, the same feeling of playing it that the original Donkey Kong Country had. These games look like DKC, they sound like DKC, and they even have a lot of the same DNA as DKC, but they're not the same experience underneath. All three of these are great games, and depending on my mood, I might get a Jones for playing any of them on a particular day. But the second and third have much more in common with each other than either does with the first. In some ways, this is a very good thing. Rare's decision to treat Diddy's Conquest as an opportunity to tinker and experiment, rather than tying it down to copying Donkey Kong Country's style exactly, is what made it so innovative, and spawned ideas that would stick with the series for many years, to the point that arguably, it's the second game that people think of when they talk about games being like Donkey Kong Country, not the first. But every now and then, I find myself wishing that they'd chosen to make a sequel that hewed closer to the original, a game that would be just as visually and musically sumptuous as Diddy's Conquest, but with gameplay that was just as endlessly replayable as the levels from the first game. And I don't think I'm the only one who feels this way, because around a decade and a half after Rare turned its back on Donkey Kong Country, Nintendo came back to the place where it had been left behind, dusted it off, and decided to give the series another try. The story of Donkey Kong's return to the limelight begins with Michael Kelbaugh, a longtime Nintendo of America employee who was sent down to run Retro Studios when Nintendo acquired it as a first-party developer, shortly after the release of Metroid Prime. Kelbaugh had been a tester for both Diddy's Conquest and Dixie's Double Trouble, and he suggested as early as 2004 that Retro might take a whack at reviving Donkey Kong Country for a new generation. Nintendo was more interested at this point in having Retro finish up the Metroid Prime trilogy, so they advised Kelbaugh to shelve the idea for a while. It probably didn't help that a team under Shigeru Miyamoto was working at that very moment on Donkey Kong Jungle Beat, and you compete directly with Miyamoto using the same franchise he's working on at your friggin' peril. But with the release of Metroid Prime 3 in mid-2007, Retro had turned the page on the most pivotal chapter of its existence, and was ready for something new. Also, Jungle Beat hadn't done all that well, and Shigeru Miyamoto was looking for another team to work on Donkey Kong so he could get back to the vital task of making DLC for Super Mario Galaxy and fixing Pikmin. Kensuke Tanabe, one of Nintendo's most experienced producers, recommended Retro for the job, and bada bing, we've got a project on our hands. By the way, if you're wondering how the team that had worked almost exclusively on a first-person shooter series for the last 8 years was so comfortable making a 2D platformer, you have to remember that this was not exactly the same team that had made Metroid Prime. Several key staff members left Retro after the series wrapped, most notably Mark Pacini, who had directed all 3 games. So, kind of like Rare under Microsoft, Retro was reaching the point in its history when Nintendo's management was having just as strong an impact on their approach as their own internal leading lights were. if not more so. And to be honest, you can tell from the game they eventually put out. Donkey Kong Country Returns is a very fun 2D platformer with old-fashioned mechanics, but for all its visual and musical references to Donkey Kong Country's history, and there are a lot of them, this is not a game that looks, feels, or frankly even sounds all that much like its 16-bit forebears. Let's take the graphics to start with. Donkey Kong Country used pre-rendered pseudo-3D backdrops that resembled high-quality matte paintings, with realistic, albeit static, shading and color. Character and enemy sprites had a similar level of detail and were drawn directly onto the background, with the surfaces of platforms tilted slightly towards the camera in order to show more detail to the player. Color palettes would vary, but in general were pretty dark and subdued compared with other platformers, with a lot of dark greens, browns, and shades of white and black. Enemies had beady little eyes and big teeth, looking more like wild animals than cartoon characters. Then we come to Donkey Kong Country Returns, and what a contrast! Literally. Shading and color gradations are much simpler here, and the palettes tend to be a lot brighter in general, though occasionally, like in the forest, this is toned down. Lots of enemies, not to mention friendly characters like the mid-level checkpoint pigs, have big old googly eyes and look more cartoonish than realistic. Backgrounds usually have fewer objects in them, except during big set-piece sections during which the camera zooms outward to make the most of the spectacle. At times, this game can even look cel-shaded, because there's almost no gradient being used on many objects. It's all a lot more stylized and dramatic than any of the games that appeared on the SNES. The soundtrack is similarly kind of off, not for a normal game, but for a game that calls itself Donkey Kong Country. It features a lot of bright, upbeat tracks with fairly simple melodies, while nearly all of the songs in the original game had multiple interwoven sections, and conveyed at least a hint of menace at some point that matched the game's generally stern appearance. That's when it isn't just reusing tracks from previous games, which you'd think would help bridge the tonal gap, but as far as I'm concerned, they don't actually suit this new style of level nearly as well as they did the levels they were originally written for. Returns is not an easy game by any means, but oddly, the graphics and music make it feel like one. As the game goes on, the "hey, we're going on an adventure" tone of the presentation clashes with the ramped-up challenges and starts to get cloying. The game is just a bit too chipper for its own good sometimes. But there's a bigger distinction between new and old that goes far beyond aesthetic changes, and that's the game's overall pace. I mentioned earlier that once you get good at Donkey Kong Country, the action moves at a very fast clip. Jumping, cartwheeling, bouncing, shooting out of barrels. You could get whiplash trying to track DK's movements around the screen in that game. And this is simply not the case for much of Donkey Kong Country Returns. The biggest culprit here is collectibles, of which this game has a superabundance, almost to the point of absurdity. Diddy's Conquest and Dixie's Double Trouble may have forced you to replay levels all the time, but at least you moved quickly in those levels. Returns is constantly urging you to stop in your tracks, to pound the ground, blow at flowers, pick up all the bananas in a formation, and just generally cover every square inch of territory and every interactable object in order to collect all the Kong letters and puzzle pieces. I know what you're thinking. Just skip them. But unlike the original Donkey Kong Country, which only used extra lives as a reward for finding secrets, in this game the Kong letters are used to unlock bonus levels. And the real kicker is that these letters are not interchangeable, the way that K. Rool tokens were in the older games. So if you get the letters in every level but one in every single world, that earns you nothing! You lose! Basically, Returns only really rewards two levels of engagement. The super casual kind, where you just breeze through the levels and don't bother collecting anything, and the hyper-obsessive completionist kind, where you play slowly and cautiously and retrace your steps every minute or so to make sure you don't miss anything. Frankly, I don't like either of these playstyles, and this is a far cry from Donkey Kong Country, where every secret was its own reward and made it easier to finish the rest of the game no matter how many you managed to find. But then, Donkey Kong Country Returns is also just very slow and deliberate in general. Donkey Kong moves more sluggishly in this game, with no ability to switch to another character, and the awkward motion controls make it difficult to get into the same kind of flow state that characterized earlier games in the series. Also, having Diddy on your back gives you a jetpack that works a lot like Flood from Super Mario Sunshine, i.e. a reliable but slow way to recover from a botched jump. And speaking of Mario, there's a franchise that Returns shares about as much of its design DNA with as it does its own namesake. Colorful, cartoony graphics and a generally childish presentation? That's Mario. Prosaic, unimaginative world names like Forest and Cliff? That's just like New Super Mario Bros. In fact, several of the world themes are virtually identical to the ones from that game, which came out only 2 years before Returns started development. Even some of the enemies feel Mario-esque. I mean, crabs? Moles that throw pickaxes? Literal piranha plants? Are you kidding me? What's next, Goombas? Okay, I can tell I'm getting a little too vehement here. The point is that this game, fun as it is, actually takes relatively little inspiration, other than music, even from Donkey Kong Country's 2 sequels, let alone the original game itself. This game does not breathe the spirit of Rareware. It's Nintendo's take on the basic idea of what Rare used to do, with the rough edges smoothed down and made to conform with Nintendo's in-house style. If the original game was a ripe banana, this is banana bread. Or better yet, a banana smoothie with lots of other fruit mixed in for variety's sake, topped off with a whole bucket load of sugar. Again though, I have to remind you, and myself, that this is not necessarily bad. I like smoothies, and Donkey Kong Country Returns is a very well-made smoothie. It's just that when I'm in the mood for a piece of fruit with some texture and that fresh kick you get from peeling it the instant before you take a bite, a smoothie is not going to cut it for me. Plus, all that sugar is bad for your teeth. Although I don't know what that would correspond to in terms of playing video games. Maybe getting a headache? But if, like me, you were a little disappointed with the direction that Donkey Kong Country Returns went in, you'll be happy to know that change was in the air. Along with ice. Ice was also in the air. And penguins. What I'm saying is, Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze was on the horizon, and almost anyone who loved the old Donkey Kong Country was bound to embrace this new entry wholeheartedly, at the risk of getting frostbite, of course. Tropical Freeze was created because the team that made Returns was left with a lot of unused ideas at the end of that game's development, and because Retro had proven to Nintendo's satisfaction that they knew what they were doing. So for this outing, the bigwigs at Nintendo stepped back and mostly let Retro have at it. Miyamoto in particular was much less involved in Tropical Freeze than he had been with Returns, and while you might think that was a bad omen, trust me, the team was better off without him and his suggestions. Now, despite what I just said, a lot of the design elements stayed essentially the same between these two games, so I'm just going to touch on a few highlights. First off, the graphics. They're pretty similar, but one thing I love is the increased amount of complexity in the background. Autumn Heights in particular has some wonderful mountain backdrops that do so much to make this feel like a real place where someone lives. But practically every area benefits from more attention being paid to little details. Heck, the names of the worlds alone show a massive improvement. Unlike Returns' frankly dull musical tiki enemies, Tropical Freeze gives each world one of several winter-themed animal tribes that have teamed up to conquer DK Isle, like a Saturday morning cartoon version of the Covenant races from Halo. Okay, not much like that, but it's better than literal blocks of wood. The soundtrack is now mostly made up of original tracks, and they even brought back David Wise to write them, which was possibly the smartest thing any Nintendo team has done in the last 15 years. This soundtrack is so good, it's bananas. In the intervening 2 decades, Wise seems to have lost none of his musical mastery. There's so much variety here, and yet every track just reeks of personality. He wrote friggin' thrash metal songs for 2 of the boss battles. And when you see how they match up to the visuals, it's just... oh man, I cannot get over it. Nintendo, release this soundtrack on CD. I don't care that nobody listens to CDs anymore. For this soundtrack, they'll go back to it. You will make bank. In any case, I don't want to spoil too much about this game, because unlike with Returns, I actually care about getting people to enjoy it, and most of you probably have the opportunity to experience it if you haven't already. I'll just say this about the gameplay. Tropical Freeze is really smart about how it sets up challenges and adapts its presentation, both graphically and musically, to match what you're playing at any given moment. It accomplishes this much more effectively than Returns did, partly because it's more ambitious with the emotions that it tries to evoke. Does it still have the same basic challenges as Returns? Yes. Does it still remind me more of other platformers than it does of Donkey Kong Country? Also yes. In this case, not New Super Mario Bros., but more along the lines of Rayman Origins, which I have to say is one of my favorite games. But the fact that Tropical Freeze isn't much like Donkey Kong Country is almost irrelevant to how much I like it. It's doing its own thing, and doing it very well, and that's exactly the kind of take-no-guff attitude that I admire as a 90s kid. Tropical Freeze isn't a carbon copy of Donkey Kong Country, but unlike Returns, it is a game that I could imagine Rare making if they'd been as on the ball in 2014 as they were in 1994. It's extremely imaginative, it has a dense and powerful sense of atmosphere, and it's got attitude out the wazoo. The Donkey Kong series couldn't possibly hope for a better heir to pass the torch to for future generations. I started out this video lamenting the fact that Nintendo never produced a truly faithful follow-up to the original Donkey Kong Country, along the lines of what the Lost Levels was to Super Mario Bros. But honestly, after dredging up the long and tangled history of this franchise, I'm not at all sad that its latest entry is so different from where things started. Both Donkey Kong Country Returns and Tropical Freeze are somewhere along a spectrum from good to great, with Returns being closer to just good, and Tropical Freeze being closer to great. None of the 5 games I've discussed in this video is a dud. They're all worth playing, and in a way they all offer something different. I called this video Donkey Kong Country is Unsurpassed, but an equally accurate title would be Every Donkey Kong Country is Unsurpassed. They're not all equally replayable, or equally immersive, or equally anything else, but I have no doubt that at some point I'll want to replay all 5, even if only in part. It's a sad fact that the gap between the present day and the last Donkey Kong game is almost as long as the one between Rare's last take on the franchise and its revival in 2010. One has to wonder if Nintendo seriously intends to let this once great intellectual property languish and collapse after it showed such promise, the way they almost did 30 years ago. Donkey Kong is one of those series where it almost seems like Nintendo forgets how good it is, and has to be reminded of its potential by somebody else, either an external partner like Rare, or their own employees at subsidiaries like Retro. But whoever's job it is to give Nintendo that advice, they don't seem to be doing it all that much these days. So I guess it's up to me. Hey, Nintendo, get those Joy-Cons out of your ears and pay attention. You need to make more Donkey Kong games. You have an experienced team who knows how to make them right, and presumably they'll be free to do it in a year or two. Or, here's a thought, hire more people to work at Retro, so they can make more than one game at a time. I know, crazy idea, but it just might work. If you want people to buy the Switch 2, which, by the way, that needs a better name, I assume you've already come up with that, but if not, get on that. You're going to need some great games with brand power, and Zelda, Mario, and Pokemon are not the only strong brands you have. Everybody loves Donkey Kong. I mean, really, what's not to love? This is an easy home run, Nintendo, so don't let the opportunity pass you by. Don't make excuses, just make more Donkey Kong games. Okay, I think that ought to do it. Now somebody get me a banana.